Hi, my name is Mpiyakhe and I am joined by Hattingh and Jacques Jonker. And today we will be discussing some of the lessons learned through the lockdown in terms of the NHI. What did we learn about the NHI through government's response during the lockdown? We will also be discussing the problems at SAA, which is, it's a never-ending drama, so we'll be discussing both of those things. I am joined by Jacques Jonker, who is a legal researcher and also an economist as well at the Free Market Foundation. Christo, who is a project manager and also a researcher at the Free Market Foundation, and also me, of course. And so maybe I'll just start with you, Chris, because I was just reading your article now that you wrote about the NHI, and it's linked in the description, by the way. I was just reading your article, and it seems like it's a very good article, by the way, and there's a lot of data backing it up. And just to give an example, you write that as of early 3rd June, the country had only added 207 additional critical care beds and 350 ventilators since the start of the lockdown on 27 March. Could you maybe elaborate more on that, on how just government wasn't ready in terms of the equipment and the beds and stuff?
Thanks, Mpiyakhe. I thought I'd put in more data just to make you happy when you read it.
I
had your voice on my shoulder.
No, I was smiling the whole time I was reading your article.
Hey, if I can achieve that, I'm happy in life. As you pointed out, obviously the critical care beds and the ventilators, that wasn't an issue, but just, the fact that I realized that COVID-19 is an unexpected disease hitting the world, and everyone was quite surprised. But it shows you, even in a hard lockdown with very limited economic activity and people moving around, government still was unable to prepare resources effectively and to source things well and to work the private sector. The private sector managed to be okay for now. We'll see for how long that goes. But even with this time that the government had, it couldn't prepare. So to think that through the national health insurance, the government could then manage the healthcare needs of almost 60 million South Africans, to me just shows you the government had this experiment with COVID. It had a chance to show marshal things, coordinate, plan. We're in mid-July. I realize the cases are increasing, but at the moment it looks like, especially in Hattingh, we're at capacity in the public health. So we're reaching full capacity, and at the end of the day, people are going to have to go to private facilities. If those private facilities obviously work with them and allow them in. I guess in a way, you don't want this sort of thing to happen where people lose their jobs, income, that sort of thing by an act of nature. But it also is useful in that regard if we learn from it. Government really can't all the healthcare we need.
Yeah, no, true. It really does seem to be the case. And I just suppose maybe just to get your thoughts, Jack. Are you surprised at just how bad they are at preparing for something? Oh, by the way, someone says he's getting an echo. Let me just on the live stream. But Jack, you can continue talking.
So no, I'm not. At all. If you look at our ranking, in terms of our total cases per million people, international comparison regards to anything numbers are useless and misleading. So you need to sort of naturalize the data and use population differences. So if you take the total case million, we are currently ranked, I think, 24th in the world. But if you take our total test per million, we are currently ranked, I think, 81st in the world. So that's a huge disparity that you don't see with other countries that have as many cases per million as we do at the moment. And yesterday I did some back of the match calculation. So you look at people. So I think it was something like 45,000 days. Now that sounds a lot. If you go and math and you people that are tested per minute, it's about 15 or 15. Now quickly consider intersect the amount of local district that we have in African municipal. You'd expect the country to at least test a single person every minute in every municipal district. At least by the moment, let's say for argument's sake, 15 people per second. Let's make it 16 people per second. So that's about 16 minutes. About 16 they test one person per minute, district per minute. About 16 minutes per district per minute getting tested. Which is absolutely horrible. So yeah, I'm surprised. I'm really not surprised. And also scapegoating the citizens to make them feel guilty. And the general problem that you see with these types of issues is that it's sort of the teacher punishing the whole class because Johnny in the back Sarah over there, he's being the naughty one. You can't really punish the whole class for that. I mean, to say that people, because the government's taking a lot of freedoms of innocent people, the freedom to purchase alcohol, and just a reminder to understand, because consumption is still legal. You cannot arrest people for something But anyway, so you are freedom to consume or to buy alcohol is taken away from effectively freedoms of choice of innocent people be conditional upon the conduct of criminals. And when I say criminals, I mean people who get drunk, go out drunk driving, cause accidents, let people end up in hospital, even kill people, get into bar fights, etc., etc. So you cannot, I think that is in principle inherently asinine to let people's freedom be conditional upon the conduct of criminals and not upon their own conduct. If I can drink alcohol responsibly in my own apartment, which I do, although not very often, sadly, then I should be able to have the freedom to do so, and so should you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean that's, and of course, coming from the classically liberal perspective, we're always very suspicious of any stats that come from the government. But even in this regard, if we take it at face value, this is what our Minister of Health is saying about the bed capacity. They simply didn't prepare well enough in any of the provinces. I obviously, like to look at the Eastern Cape, which is a mess in so many regards, but even in other provinces. So, I mean, this to me shows perhaps the folly of central planning and the folly of trying to account for what's going to happen in every province and according to how people act. So it's assuming that a bureaucrat in Pretoria can decide in all 9 provinces people are going to act exactly the same way in urban areas, in rural areas, in semi-urban areas, and then to say, okay, all the hospitals, not when you centralize things in this way through the government, things aren't agile, things can't move, things can't shift, people can't react well, and that then puts more strain on the system, where now we should be making it as stress-free as possible for the healthcare professionals in the public healthcare sector. In many ways, they're the most precious resource. This sort of thing, this trying to plan everything centrally, adds more stress to their lives, and some of them, maybe drop out after a while. So I think we always need to keep in mind, no matter who's in charge, if it's Minister Mpiyakhe, if it's President Ramaphosa, if it's Piet Pompies, whoever, the point is we shouldn't rely on any person in charge to decide all these things. The private sector should have as much room to move in this regard, so then it can allocate the resources the best.
So this is basically how you inculcate a culture of disrespect for not the law in general, but the constitution, the rule of law, and the concept of constitutionalism and being ruled by the rule of law, is when you abuse your powers to the extent that the NCCC and the Ramaphosa administration have been doing. then you aren't going to get a lot of citizens to abide by the regulations that you want them to abide by, irrespective of whether the regulations may be reasonable or not. So, for instance, use the example of tax morality or tax morale, whatever the specific term may be. So if you consistently end up wasting taxpayers' money, you're going to see more and more cases of illegal tax evasions. Strictly speaking, it's illegal. Morally, that's a debate for another day. But you are going to see more and more of those cases come about. And it's the same when you constantly promulgate arbitrary regulations that are completely nonsensical. You are going to get people that are going to tell you, listen, go stuff yourself. I mean, for instance, I think any reasonable person can believe and will acknowledge that it is not inherently unreasonable to wear a mask in the case of a respiratory pandemic for which there is no vaccine. But currently we are seeing a massive backlash against masks being mandated, not because people think wearing a mask itself is a bad idea, but because of the government's track record with respect to the regulations when viewed from a holistic perspective. That is inherently what the problem is. So yes, you are really sort of breeding this culture of discontent and disobedience. After a while, you sort of reach a point, even though the line is not clear, but where you cross the line in citizens' minds. And what happens at the end of the day is citizens simply do not give a damn about what you have to say anymore. And I think this also comes down to a lack of transparency from not just the NCCC, but the president himself. Yes, he hosts these imbizas or whatever he calls them online with the citizens. But take, for instance, examples from foreign countries, New Zealand, Britain, the US, even though Britain and the US haven't really done all that well. But what do their presidents do? They have direct press conferences with journalists where the journalists can confront them directly. And Cyril Ramaphosa may have done this on one or two occasions, but the fact of the matter is you would at least expect two briefings twice a week, at least from the president of your country. And as Eusebius Makaisa actually pointed out, Ramaphosa is basically just, I can't remember the exact words that Makaisa uses, but Ramaphosa is basically just echoing whatever his NCCC says. And then Gareth van Onselen in his Business Day piece today also alluded to this fact that Cyril Ramaphosa goes behind the scenes, pulling the strings. He doesn't make up his own mind, give his own opinion. When last have you seen a journalist asking him, so Mr. President, your NCCC is saying this. There's also the counter evidence to the initial evidence. What is your opinion on this? Tell us what you think about this. But no, instead he's he may be catering to interests behind the scenes. You never know. But that's always a possibility. I'm not saying it's probable, but it is definitely possible considering the track record of the ANC. But Onselen also said we are ruled not by a president but by a party. And at the end of the day, this is a very corrupt party, and you cannot really blame the citizens for any form of lawlessness, whether the lawlessness it may be morally justifiable or not, if those who are in charge of promulgating laws and regulations do their job in a highly unethical way. Mpiyakhe, I think you're muted.
So I guess in the broader context of the only country that I've sort of thought has handled this whole thing well is South Korea. They realized what was coming, and because of their experience with SARS, of course, they realized a good way to handle this sort of pandemic is track and trace. So you figure out who's got the virus, who they've been in contact with, and you quarantine those people. Then you don't restrict just the whole country or millions of people's other freedoms. Of course, then there's concerns about privacy and that sort of thing, and that's a good discussion. But by that sort of metric, you need very fast testing. This has also been a big issue in the US, where President Trump hobbled the ability of the CDC and other private sector players to do very fast, effective testing because he wanted, of course, to have control and oversight over everything. So you need to know very quickly with this sort of virus who people have been in contact with, how they've interacted, where they've moved, maybe in their own little sphere, whether they've traveled or not, whether they've taken the train or a taxi or something like that. So the fact that the National Health and Laboratory Service takes so long at turning around testing means by the time it comes back, the person who might have COVID has already interacted with how many, hundreds, maybe thousands of people just by extrapolation and exponential factors. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I think the private sector, especially Lancet Laboratories, they've done well in terms of turnaround time. But again, this sort of thing, this lack of time at getting testing turned around means also that some provinces might be under stricter lockdown for longer because the government isn't even sure of their own numbers. They're not sure how many people have the virus and how many don't. It makes it very difficult to have an accurate picture of, is the virus actually spreading a lot or is it not? It makes it very difficult to be responsive in how you react, in where you allocate resources. So I guess it's a range of factors. And again, it points to me to where if South Africans still think the government can centrally manage and monopolize the management of all of our healthcare, we're in for a very big shock with the NHI. It's gonna make even the private sector, which admittedly has its own issues in terms of medical aids and that sort of thing, it's gonna make even that sort of null and void, where no one will have any measure of quality healthcare.
Basically, what had to happen is with any business rescue plan, the rescue practitioners have to set out certain conditions that have to be met in order for the plan to come into force, to be implemented. Now, there were two specific conditions here, and this is what all the fuss was about. And that is that in terms of paragraph 42 in the business plan, 42.1.2, the approval of both the Minister of Public Enterprises as well as the Minister of Finance, to the extent necessary, and I'm quoting here, as the executive authority for SAA, their approval there was needed for implementation of aspects of the rescue plan which involves transactions requiring such approval in the first place in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, read with the significance and materiality framework for SAA. But that was only the one thing a lot of people don't know about it. But then, in terms of paragraph 42.1.5, and I'm going to read this for the listeners and viewers, confirmation of government support and commitment to providing the requisite funding for the various commitments stipulated in paragraph 28 of the Business Rescue Plan. This is to be evidenced by way of a letter of support from the Department of Public Enterprises with the concurrence of the Department of Treasury. So this is what occurred on Wednesday. The deadline for this letter was the 15th of July. Basically, what had to happen is both ministers, Mpiyakhe and Gordon, had to effectively co-sign a letter saying that government commits to acquiring the funding. Now, there are two ways through which they can do this. They can put the ball on the taxpayers' back, or they can mobilize funding through the private sector. Now, what this letter did is, in the letter, it says that they commit to mobilizing funding, but they do not say how they will do this. Now, Minister Mboweni can still refuse to have Treasury provide the funding. But if he does decide to have Treasury going to court on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, the 21st of July, in order to interdict Minister Mboweni from using Section 16 of the Public Finance Management Act to obtain quote-unquote emergency funds for aid. I think this is illegal. I tend to agree with them. It is illegal. They asked Minister Mboweni to confirm he won't act in such a prima facie legal manner, but he hasn't responded, which is why they're going to court to interdict him. So this was what all the fuss was about for the letter on Wednesday, and this was why I personally was disappointed in Minister Mboweni, is he could have simply refused to sign the letter itself. You know, even though it uses ambiguous language, and even though there's a slight possibility that taxpayers may not have to foot this bill and the private sector will come through, it is probable that Minister Mboweni and Minister Gordon are not on the same page with respect to how they interpret the phrase mobilized funding. So Minister Mboweni has in mind, okay, we're going to ask the private sector to step in. Minister Gordon will probably not have a problem with Treasury doing this. So I really hope that there is a situation where SAA cannot fly, the dead bird cannot be resurrected without it itself. I mean, government still has those guarantees towards the major banks, the 16.4 billion. If the private doesn't come through, we will have to foot that bill. If the private sector doesn't provide the working capital for SAA in order to pay off its own debt, because it's still a guarantee as well as I understand. But the problem is at least 10.3 billion that will have to be provided to SAA, and it will be a lot more actually than 10.3 billion. The cost will skyrocket to about 18, 19 billion rand, considering all the debt from SAA subsidiaries, Mango, etc., that have to be settled, and also the operating losses of SAA that will also have to. Yes. Well, I mean, probably SAA can sell off Mango. The question is, will they do it? But what I wanted to say was that the operating loss will also constitute something like 6.4 billion rand over the next 3 years. And if you look at what they aim to do with respect to SAA's balance sheet, specifically its debt ratios, etc., it will be a monumental task to resurrect that stricken airline. I do not think it is possible. I really hope the DA succeeds in their court case to interdict Treasury from providing funds to SAA on top of the already guaranteed 16.4 billion. And I really do hope that this rescue plan does not go through. It becomes dead in it is rendered dead in the water, that the private sector doesn't step up, and that SAA can be killed off finally. So what people need to consider is, if we assume that that money would have been taxed anyway and would have been inside government's coffers anyway, the opportunity cost of not using it in areas such as and RDP housing, etc. I mean, what we mean by when we say it is inefficient to keep SAA on life support effectively, is that the amount of money that they are spending relative to the amount of people that will keep their jobs is extremely inefficient. If you basically calculate on the back of a matchbox the costs to keep each employee employed, the amounts of employees that they will keep employed, it is extremely high it is an extremely high cost per employee. That money can be used more efficiently, meaning you can employ more people with it if you use that same amount of money, if not even less money, in a different sector, for example. And that is basically what it comes down to, run inefficiently. And it is also effectively subsidizing flights for people, because remember, if you look at the business rescue plan for the previous financial year, SAA ran, I think, 4 domestic routes. Not one was profitable. Now, an ordinary company would have to jack up their prices in order to make a profit. But SAA is not doing that because they know they can be bailed out by the taxpayer, or at least that was their hope. Hopefully that will not happen now. So yes, effectively the money can be used for important causes in South Africa: healthcare, education, efficient policing, etc. And it can be used more efficiently as well, in the sense that you can probably create way more jobs with way less money than the amount of money that they're spending on it, considering the little amount of jobs that they will be able to keep with that amount of money.
Yeah, so of course it presumes that the government should play a quote-unquote developmental role, and I guess in that regard the state has played a very good role, because we're de-developing the country. We're devolving the economic progress and the economic growth and the prosperity that we had before the state started being so terribly interventionist. Of course, President Mbeki wasn't perfect, but at least under his tenure, there was a bit more economic growth and a bit more recognition for the pragmatism of letting the market work. And that's difficult for people to say, of course, from both sides, our side and the other side. But I think in that regard, he did the best he could, given all the other issues. So you have to make that shift in terms of thinking the government shouldn't be responsible for development in the first place. Where it has been responsible, it has failed abysmally. So when we talk about SAA and Eskom and other SOEs, fine, they can create jobs to an extent. But, I mean, let's presume for a minute, and I know as classical liberals we will scoff at this, but let's presume, okay, a certain amount of South Africans really can't afford this essential service. Why isn't government focusing its resources on providing that essential service? Why is it continually bailing out an airline, for example? Given COVID-19, international airlines like Emirates, British Airways, Lufthansa, American Airlines, they're all struggling a lot. No airline is going to be really profitable now. So to think that SAA 2.0 can now be given more taxpayer money and somehow be profitable and allow the country to be proud of it and that sort of thing, to me is the worst kind of folly. And it presumes that SAA will not be subject to the same rules that other airlines are. So I really don't get the logic and the thinking behind it. I think at the moment, not that it will happen, but I wish that the government would realize, okay, we need to provide for 20 million people essential services. Let's lower our spending on other things. Let's focus. Let's become a lean, mean service delivery machine. And let's uplift those people who really can't uplift themselves and help them. And I think, again, to go back to the point earlier on the episode, I think a lot of South Africans would support that kind of thing, that if they see their taxes being used well, to really, maybe then they would pay more taxes and be more willing with that sort of thing. So you need a complete rejigging of how much the government is trying to take on. Of course, inevitably government tries to feed itself, so it's a beast that is always looking to gobble up more. That's why we're having talk now about the pension funds and that fund all these grand government plans. But for as long as the spending mentality goes, we're not going to see a real economic growth. It's easy for government to employ all of us. They can say, we're going to have a highway building project between Johannesburg and Cape Town. We're going to give all of you teaspoons and you're going to dig whatever trenches and stuff is needed. We would all be employed forever, but that's not to say it's real economic growth. So I think we need a complete rejigging of what we assume this. Yeah, thanks, Mpiyakhe. Always a pleasure, Jacques. Hope you guys have a good weekend. Let's see what fresh surprises the government has in store for us next week. It's amazing what fancy schemes they're coming up with to try and fix what's happened through COVID-19.
Maybe, perhaps, we'll see government starting a liquor store SAA chain or something like that, you know.
Then I might actually support government action.
Yeah, perhaps. Might even go full-blown communist if they do that.